Okay, hello, welcome. Happy Thursday to the second to last event in our Thursday series. My name is Shannon Jackson, and on behalf of Professor Greg Niemeyer, Sachi Mulkey, Zihan Liu, our co-teachers, it's a pleasure to welcome you to another lecture, open lecture on Thursdays in our course, Video Art in Context. Some of you know that our first unit was focused on video art across many art forms, a second unit around video art as social intervention, and we're thinking about all those topics, but also the topic of circulation in these last few weeks, thinking about back-end and front-end issues about technologies, economies, systems, and platforms that on which video art forms and media art forms are circulate, are shared, received, manipulated, consumed. The fact that we're able to offer this course, that we're able to offer it to students, and that we're also able to offer teaching to our wonderful GSIs as well as host speaking events like this in this beautiful theater is thanks to a generous donation from the Kramlich Art Foundation, thereby allowing this course to be a vehicle for advancing that foundation's mission in education, research, and public programming in the field of video and media art. It's also thanks to an incredible collaboration with BAMPFA staff who produce these events and produce wonderful recordings afterward. I hope you can help me thank the Kramlich Art Foundation and BAMPFA staff for all they do for us. When it comes to thinking about both the aesthetics of video art, the social and political issues revolving around video art, and when it comes to thinking about issues of access, circulation, and consumption, and education in the field of video art, it is incredibly propitious that we have Rudolf Frieling here to help explicate and inform around those key topics. Rudolf Frieling is currently the Chief Curator of Media Arts at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. He joined SFMOMA in 2006 after being recruited from ZKM, Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, Germany, which some of you may know is one of the earliest and most important venues formed to dedicated really to the field of video, of the then emerging field of video and media art. While at ZKM, Frieling was involved in many formative exhibitions and initiatives, including the development of Media Art Net, a database for archiving and providing access to information about cutting-edge artists in the field. That platform, along with many other initiatives that he's been a part of, have been central for really even defining the field, of telling us that this is a field and creating frames and categories for understanding it. At SFMOMA, Frieling has been at the center of even more projects and initiatives that have transformed the museum, including the creation of what we lovingly call the 7th floor at SFMOMA, where we can always hope to find stellar exhibitions in time-based media art fields and see them in action, as well as in all different floors throughout the museum. Frieling has curated an array of exciting group shows and solo shows, and I'll just give you a sense of a few. For instance, in collaboration, I think the first major show he curated at SFMOMA, Works from Media Art, the Media Arts Collection in 2008. Also, The Art of Participation, 1950 to now. And he, jumping ahead, co-curated soundtracks, a really cutting-edge exhibition in terms of its layout and technology, as well as assembly of artists for what it might mean to curate sound. And also he's been at the center of monographic retrospectives, such as one on Bruce Conner, It's All True, recently on Suzanne Lacey, We Are Here, and even more recently on Nam June Paik, who has been, I think, for our students, was the first image that I think we showed on the very first day of class of a time-based media artist. Rudolf was at the center of SFMOMA's exhibition on that key formative artist. Rudolf and his staff have indeed been key to activating a range of works throughout the museum that our students have been allowed to see wonderfully in the last few weeks, including Chargier's Erratic and Ragnar's The Visitors. Moreover, Frieling is a co-editor of a new database, which I'm privileged to have joined in co-editing, a platform for media art called Media Art 21, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that, as well as many other projects, initiatives he has ahead, and that he has behind in his incredibly stellar career. Help me welcome Rudolf Frieling.
Thanks, Shannon. No pressure. I will focus on maybe a few things, mostly related to our collection. But before I do that, I also want to thank you, Shannon. You have always been such an amazing ally here, and I have had the opportunity to participate in a number of events, conversations, publications, and I feel like I've been here for 16 years now, so you realize I actually like this place here. I like working here, and in 2006 I literally gave my very first public appearance here at UC Berkeley as part of Ken Goldberg's and Greg Niemeyer's lecture series at the time, and I was calling it Not Making Sense of Modern Art, because a colleague of ours at SFMOMA had established a sort of educational model that he called Making Sense of Modern Art. So I was trying to disrupt that, although we didn't use the word disrupt at the time. And in some ways, I think this gives you a sense of my thinking already, which is that you cannot just make sense. It is always a process, and it involves many, sometimes conflicting perspectives, and in a way to keep sense-making open. In that sense, to not make sense, I think is a lot behind what I'm doing. I also want to say I've taught for more than 10 years at CCA in San Francisco, and my course was called Media Art in Context. So I sympathize with Shannon's and Greg's conception of this series, and as a because I was speaking here, not here in at BAMPFA, but somewhere on campus. For a moment, I thought I could make this a much more personal lecture, and maybe not have such kind of dry title. That's not very sexy, frankly. But I decided to really work on a few examples of how to keep meaning open and developing, and sort of an ongoing process within the context of a collection and a museum. And as a personal sort of note, before I dive into it, I do want to say that I have not studied art history, although I've taken some courses, but I've actually majored in English literature. And my thesis was about James Joyce. And if you've ever tried to read James Joyce, you will know that it is damn hard to make any sense out of the first reading. You will have to read it again and again. And in fact, there are reading groups who sort of constantly discuss the frankly open network of allusions and sort of word building from word building to world building, maybe. Really being inspired by Umberto Eco's seminal notion of the open work of art from the early 60s, I really found out later that that was a perfect preparation for being or becoming a media art curator. So, as Shannon proposed a few things that I might talk about, I will try to come to that as well. But at the same time, I also want to sort of disrupt the knowledge or the perception of a museum acquiring objects and then just showing objects, even within media art. That is not the case, and you will see why. So in a nutshell, to get us started thinking, the notion of time-based media is very often a complex one, and one that is based on changing formats, changing displays, different experiences, and we are faced with the fact that none of that is captured in any way when we confront literature, academic literature in particular. So what do we do when we research, when we want to curate, when we want to exhibit, or even to collect? And that question, what do we actually need to work properly, is behind this idea that we need different tools and different platforms, possibly, and platforms that allow us to learn, but also to teach, possibly to build knowledge collectively about works that are experience-based. And that's a little bit of a catchphrase for a lot of things, but we'll see more in detail what that means. Also, how do we work with the artist, the institution, to re-envision a work that is never given, but always versioned, updated, and adapted? And I'm going to propose a few sort of hypothetical lines of inquiry for this that may lead us to a notion of, let's say, new methodologies in media art history. So a tentative conclusion is the work in media art typically demands a different tool set and a different mindset. So for one, do not think in terms of an image. Your art historical knowledge or your art historical training might misguide you here. Secondly, do not think in terms of narrative. Your film knowledge might misguide you here. And thirdly, do not think in terms of medium or medium specificity, although that might come in handy for the modernists among us. But contemporary works of media art go beyond any single definition or condition. So instead, what do we do? I think what I'm trying to do is, or trying to propose, is that we need to think in clusters of information and perspective and experiences and points of view. So not only is the work often multimedia, the knowledge needed to deal with it is also necessarily, or must be necessarily, multi-perspective, multi-dimensional. And I know that Lynn talked here, so I don't know, I told her to not speak about this one. She didn't. Okay, good. Because that was a really kind of a watershed moment for me, curating, bringing works into the collection, but also curating shows with it. And just to say quickly, this is actually the homepage. So the work is called Agent Ruby. And I think it's okay to say that Lynn Hirschman-Leeson is the reason that I actually came to SFMOMA in the first place. She sent me an email saying, hey, they're looking for someone. Why don't you apply? And at the time, working at ZKM in Germany, I thought, why should they ever get a German guy to the US? So, okay, sure, I can try. Anyway, it all worked out. So I'm grateful for Lynn, and she's been a friend since the 90s. But when I came, I obviously was thrilled to realize that SFMOMA was one of the first museums to commission online works, and this was among the first works to be commissioned. It's a generative work that was produced in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it has a relationship to film and video insofar as Ruby is a character coming out of Lynn's film Technolust from 1997. And Lynn called this character, or this agent, an artificial intelligence, a web agent theoretically reflecting her encounters with users. The work features a custom-made code of artificial intelligence embodied in Ruby as an online bot that chats with users. And it's online. You can just go to agentruby.net, which will lead you to this sort of early vision of Siri. But it's not Siri. That's important. It's actually much better, I think. But just a little bit of technical background. It is an artificial intelligence database of files populated with personality traits developed out of her film Technolust, and the artist programmers wove Ruby's personality traits into an artificial intelligence markup language, AIML. Starting with a base set of intelligent responses to subjects such as geography, history, and economics, developed by Dr. Richard Wallace in the ALICE AIML, then customizing that set to responses for Ruby using the interpretive program D. I have no idea what D is, but just for those who might be interested in those details. And she added an animation, and the moods of Ruby are actually reflected in sort of a set of different expressions, facial expressions. When I joined the museum, I wanted to make sure that we can collect literally anything we want or we feel is needed to give a picture as complex and as diverse as possible of contemporary and media art. So my predecessor, Benjamin Weil, actually said, no, we should just produce something and not collect. Net art is not to be collected, is to be actually just kept online as long as it lasts. And I said, well, if there is a problem, then what? Somebody needs to take care of this. This is an important work, so I think it is our job as original commissioners to bring it into the collection. And what does that mean? Nobody knew at the time. Nobody knew what kind of resources are needed, what kind of technical infrastructure is needed, etc. So we started with a working group on that, and one of the things that we learned is Ruby is maybe not as intelligent as we think today. It is not such a learning environment as it might be natural today. For example, she still thinks, the bot, still thinks that George Bush is president, and you would have to literally manipulate the database to change that. So you need input. But Ruby has a brain, and the brain is very much an alter ego of Lynn, I would argue. And the brain is literally, how do you make intelligent conversation? How do you respond to questions that you didn't see coming? Well, sometimes you know an answer and you say that, what you know, And sometimes you do not know an answer, and then what do? A conversational strategy is you change the subject. You go somewhere else. Say, well, by the way, have you seen this film? She has a few preferences in film history. And in some ways, this conversation is not straightforward, is not giving you straightforward answers. It is, however, engaging you in a really quirky, interesting, weird way. And that, I think, engages you deeply, personally. However, it can also frustrate you when you actually want to have an intelligent conversation, say, about feminism. I tried that because I thought Lynn is a feminist. She's, one of the champions and pioneers in that movement throughout the 60s, 70s, and so on. But for some strange reason, Ruby really shied away from that topic and couldn't really properly answer. And I'm saying that because I exhibited the work in 2012, I believe, and we called it the Agent Ruby Files. And one of the things that we discovered as we brought the work into the collection was this was, again, premiered in 2002. We brought it into the collection in 2008 and looked more deeply into it in 2009. So there had been a history of 6 or 7 years of ongoing conversations that were all stored. Then I thought, well, that is interesting. Actually, the back end of such a work is not just an interface where you can chat. There is a growing body of conversations that are being collected and stored. And wouldn't it be interesting to exhibit those histories, that sort of base, and this kind of generative principle could maybe provide meaningful insight into what people are actually talking about. Not that that's necessarily interesting, but perhaps there are some interesting components there. And my initial naive thought was, well, we're just going to print it all out and show this is the archive in paper. And then our digital consultant said, you might want to rethink that because you would have to kill an entire forest to print it all out on paper. So you don't want to do that. Yeah. Okay. So what do? Well, let's try to save some conversations and let's try to actually commission certain topics so we can document a way of thinking and a way of operating within a thematic framework, which is why then we had a series of binders and there were topics such as feminism, economy, dreams, and so on. And it was important for me to take something that was living online and to take it out of this online space that the museum had created called e-space, and to actually make it something tangible in the galleries. The sort of the purest way of exhibiting an online work has always been you just place a monitor and a keyboard in the gallery, and that's it. And I always felt that's not enough. You can do that at home. As a matter of fact, you could, at the time, you could also do that if you had experienced the work at the time, and if you had one of the earliest smartphones, a Palm Pilot. There was a specific function where you could access the work on a Palm Pilot. Well, that doesn't exist anymore. But we created a wall text that was based on a conversation with Ruby. It wasn't a straightforward wall text, but again, responsive to the quirkiness of what Ruby would provide. And we created these binders in which you could read how people talk to Ruby, but also how bots talk to bots. And you realize there is so much crap out there. There is so much broken conversations that you need to look for certain pearls almost in it. But it does teach you something about the way that conversations operate. Electronically, more specifically. And what it also did was it sort of paved the way for us to think about collecting online works. And here's the address today. By the way, why was it changed? Well, somebody occupied, in a brief moment, nobody took care of the URL, and then somebody bought this, and I think attached it to some kind of porn site. So we had to kind of rethink how to create the URL. But the word got around that we had acquired Agent Ruby, and then two artists I very much admire, Harold Fletcher and Miranda July, approached me and saying, hey, we have this platform that, that is done now. We don't want to deal with it anymore. We created this Learning to Love You More in 2002 and kept it going for 6 years. And now in 2009, we're ready to sell it, basically. It was literally a purchase we made. And I'm not going into the complexities of this purchase because it was not just a website and files and code. It was also a whole archive of correspondence and sometimes even paper models that were sent to the artists. And anyway, it is also still online. We are committed to keeping these things accessible in that way. And what you see here is one example out of 70, and there were assignments and about roughly speaking 8,000 contributions over time to this work over the years. And basically, it's like in class. You get an assignment and you produce your responses to those assignments. In this particular case, recreate this snapshot. Some of those were also kind of challenging, maybe on a more personal or emotional level, like take a picture of your parents kissing, or take a picture of underneath your bed, or record video, record audio, draw something, and so on. What I wanted to point out, though, is that from the get-go, this online project was meant to be translated into space, and here you see a few examples how this happened over time. They were sort of improvised ways of pointing to some specific assignments or to just the ethos of the whole project, of being collaborative, participatory, and low-tech. This was not about AIML or any kind of cutting-edge technology. This was just the idea of a platform where you could submit your work. And eventually, that led to the idea that one could also just focus on a single assignment and then exhibit that. And as a matter of fact, the agreement that we had with the artist was, whatever you do, we give you two conditions for future displays. One is that you always list the entire context of the assignments, because this is our artistic contribution, the way that we thought about specific assignments, which is what you see here. This is from a show that we did in 2011 called The More Things Change. And it was a collection show, and I suggested that we exhibit Learning to Love You More. But the second stipulation was you need to collaborate with someone. And that collaboration, in a way, continues this idea of generative growth and generative transformation. And what I did at the time was I asked a UC Berkeley professor, Stephanie Siruko, to come up with a response, because her work is also very much about social practice and reflecting on copying and appropriation and so on. And she proposed a quite stunning, radical, counterintuitive thing, which was to say, well, everything is online accessible. What if we translated everything, literally every thing out of these 8,000 contributions into a time-based medium. Sounds crazy? And as a matter of fact, I think it was a pretty crazy enterprise for Stephanie. But that's what we ended up doing. And we showed we showed 70 videos that were translating text into text on video. Audio was obviously just, time-based media already. Drawings were just compilations like a slideshow and so on. And we paired them, carefully taking note of audio, not conflicting audio, etc. And then we built this shed around it, and I thought that was a very interesting response to this job. And then I had the opportunity to do another display at the University of Michigan a few years later. And I thought, I'm just going to show this work again that Stephanie did, with one exception. I'm going to add one assignment, and this one assignment was, in fact, this one here. Recreate this snapshot. And then you have this question. It's a very typical curatorial question. Well, how do you show this in space? Because it's all files. It's part of an online project. And I took cues from some other examples, and I decided, well, of course, we will print out every single photograph that was submitted. And in some ways, that seemed like a very straightforward and simple thing, but then you realize, well, how do we print this out? And some photos are really, really low resolution. Others are higher resolution. And the simple answer to that curatorial problem was to say, well, we decide on, I think we had 4 different sizes, and these sizes correspond to the resolution of the original file that was sent. Which is why you end up with this sort of rendering of all the pictures at once, of one assignment. And what I find interesting about that is that you typically cannot perceive it that way. So you are online and you click through one image after another if you dive into this one particular assignment, or you listen to one video after another. What if everything is all there at your disposal in a way, and you can walk by? So it's a really different approach to exhibiting an archive, and I thought that was quite successful, frankly. But I'm also pointing this out because around the same time, our museum was approached by Google. And I'm sure you're sort of familiar with this idea, the Google Art Project. And I was a strong lobbyist of this not becoming just about paintings, because that is what is obviously the predetermined notion of, you make works from a museum collection accessible, you always almost invariably think about paintings. And I said, no, we have to be more diverse in that, and we have to include a work of media art. And I thought, let's propose Learning to Love You More, which you now see in this collection of SFMOMA works. You see on the top right corner. And this is actually the image that we produced for Google. And it's sort of the same approach. You actually have a parallel grid of every single page that Learning to Love You More has. So it's 70 pages. But what does Google offer you? The one feature that we may love if we want to get deep into a work is you can zoom. And this is actually when you zoom. And you realize that is just absurd. It doesn't make sense to zoom into this kind of archive. But it is the one tool that Google offered. So it is interesting that we have a work of art in this context of representation of a museum collection that defies the accessibility in that way, and that basically returns you to the original website, which, I'd say, well, that's the point in the first case. Because, you can just go online and access the work itself. You don't need Google for that. So, I love the absurdities of these tools and platforms, and to really push us in a way to think about, well, what do we need, really? What kind of platforms would help us think about works that we don't know, for example, that we've never experienced in person. And one of these, let me just go to the next slide here. One of these experiences as a curator coming to a museum is that you obviously, well, I was even on a different continent, so I hadn't seen basically anything that the museum had done prior to my arrival. So how can I be responsible for a collection where half of the works I've never experienced them? One thing is you just try to put it on the calendar and you show the work. And in 2010, I was collaborating with my colleague in photography, Sandy Phillips, who was working on a show about voyeurism and surveillance called Exposed. It was a really beautiful touring show that included I was able to include a few media works. And I said, well, surveillance, that is Julia Scher. Julia Scher is the artist addressing surveillance in the US, if not worldwide, since the late 80s. And I said, well, let's show the work. And my colleague said, you can't. It's impossible. We don't know how to show this. And I said, what? Why? Why don't we know how to show this? And then it turns out, well, it's complicated. It has software, it has interfaces, it has interactive displays, and so on. So we don't know how to do this anymore. I said, okay. Let's table it for a moment and let's think about it. But then you also go into the archive and you find things. And once you have experienced a work of hers, and I'm going to give you a moment of that right now with this audio. Once you hear her voice, at least I am hooked. Maybe you're hooked as well. Okay, let me try this again.
Warning, cellular changes are not being recorded here. The machines in this hallway are loading automatically. We cannot land here. Alert, we cannot land here. This system is not a weapon. This system is not a weapon. This surveillance system is not a weapon. Oh no, of course not. Warning, sharp overhead blades in action now. Warning, sharp blades cutting through this space now. Predicting uncivil weather and continental war games ahead. Wild eagles are being born out of these yellow and black balls. Take a look. Wild eagles, here now, in this area. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for listening. This is quintessential Julia Scher. This kind of voice, this kind of sort of generating almost poetry of public announcements, and again making it seem reasonable, maybe even logical in certain spaces, but then you wonder, what? Wait. So I was intent on finding ways of showing predictive engineering and...
Warning.
Okay. And I'm going to take you briefly through a history of the work, which is complex. And I'm going to start with this one image, which is from 1993. And it was the location of the museum's first location on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco, the War Memorial Building. where SFMOMA was located until 1995. And as you see, there's a signage about a show called Thresholds and Enclosures, and this was a corridor leading up to that. And you see, if you look, you see two monitors, but you see two displays that are sort of not linked, not hooked up, or something is missing, so it's incomplete and maybe broken. And to complicate this even further, this was a site-specific intervention, not just in one corridor, but in two corridors at the same time. And the corridors looked identical. And then you would see stuff like this. And it looked like surveillance closed-circuit camera. And you thought, wait a minute, is this just in the other corridor right now? So you would rush over, and then, of course, there was nothing. But you would also see yourself. So you knew that this was also a live system. And you just questioned, as a viewer, as a visitor, well, where do these images come from? What is happening where? And the basic conceit of this work is that you have a mix of live and pre-recorded images that get constantly circulated within the space, seemingly without a predictable pattern. And then, as I said, we moved to the Mario Botta building on 3rd Street and in 1995, and a few years later, my then predecessor, Bob Riley, decided, well, we should do predictive engineering again, and it was then called Predictive Engineering 2, or better, to the power of 2. And once again, images of transgression were pre-recorded, and this is an interesting image because I know anecdotally that as they were recording this, a trustee came out of the elevator and was slightly shocked to see naked people running around at SFMOMA. But also other action in spaces that seemed sort of behind the scenes, like on the right in the basement, or other spaces you couldn't quite identify that were maybe more troubling. Not that naked people could not be troubling, but that was sort of an uncertainty around what you were actually seeing. To some extent, I want to, as I was preparing this lecture, I tried to assemble a few quotes by Julia, and each time I saved this, all the quotes were turned into numbers. So like the file, the document file, the Word doc file was somehow, infiltrated by aliens or something. I don't know. So I only have one quote for you. But we acquired the work, and now let me just see if I can find this quote. Yes, here it is. So we acquired the work, and Julia Scher stated, "The work already has had an exhibition history that was blending at least 3 versions into a new configuration. The work acquired was called PE2, but was all Predictive Engineering 2, but was already a practice of responding to architectural and social contexts. From day 2 of its second presentation, which happened to be at the power plant in Toronto, the work had a vision of its future. Empty boxes and leftover gear sit atop monitor brackets, and each new iteration of predictive engineering includes images recorded during previous iterations, so the piece grows exponentially with each showing. The data harvesting and gear accumulation cycle continues." She also, somewhere else, she also called it a self-document device, or a self-documenting device. And then the sort of responsiveness of this is sort of like Ruby is somehow an extension of Lynn Hirschman. Surveillance and the uncertainties that come with it, and the troubling of it is also embodied in just Julia Scher's personality. So as we were preparing a third iteration of predictive engineering, we were at a conference at Tate Modern, and her contribution consisted in actually being on stage with a fire extinguisher as the alarm was going off in the museum. She had arranged for the museum to actually activate the alarm for us. So everybody was then just filing out and like, what's going on here? Nobody knew. So that is Julia Scher as well. And then we basically had this once in a lifetime, I guess, opportunity of getting funding from the Mellon Foundation to what we called the Artist Initiative. And each department picked one work that required extensive care and analysis and documentation to be able to show this again in the future. And I picked predictive engineering because we did not know how to do this again. And we took 2 years, and it was done in the context of then a show that I called Film as Place, which was the opening statement in 2016 in our building. And it made sense also to program predictive engineering into that show, into that group show, because predictive engineering, the one thing that we knew was it is a response to architecture. And the funny thing is, architecture seems to be permanent, and then until you realize it's actually not. Building changes, buildings change, institutions change, and so it made sense to say, well, here are we again, once again, getting into a new building in 2016. So let's respond to that challenge by working with Julia Scher on this. And here you see an image out of that where it was not a dedicated gallery, but once again, a passage into other works. And none of that looks literally like anything that you had seen in prior iterations, but it was still sort of the same language, only that monitors had changed. Now there were big flat screens. You still had, black and yellow tape marking zones. There was gear that was not used. There were alerts. This is one is currently repairing predictive engineering and predictive engineering to the power of 2. So the correct title is not just PE2, PE3, but always to the power of. So it's exponentially growing. And one of the big questions we had, well, how do we incorporate previous iterations here? How do we record anything? If this is a self-documenting device, do we want to record everything throughout the entire show? No, this would totally blow up our storage space, like terabytes would be needed for that. And then who looks at this, what is stored? I certainly don't want to look at it. It seems we need samples. We need to sample basically previous iterations and find a way to combine old footage with new pre-recorded footage. But also, hey, it's 2016. It's not enough to just replicate this gesture, this sculptural gesture. We also need to work with new tools. And one of those tools was a text messaging service by security by Julia. And you could subscribe to this text messaging service. The things that you just heard as audio were in the space, but you could also let her invade your personal space. What's the most personal space you have? Your phone. So it was coming to you once a day at noon with a new message, a new alert. And this was one example. But also, and again, this is what I just loved about, or still love about Julia. She was thinking, let me see if I find that quote, because it was, she was constantly rethinking how we think about space and how we address space. And one iteration or one moment of that was, well, obviously you show spaces people cannot access, so you make the building transparent and porous in a way. Here is somebody seemingly desperately caught in some kind of weird angle on the roof of the building. But also it had a vision of what Julia called an alien landing pad. And at that point we said, okay, come on, we're not going to deal with aliens here. But it's interesting, actually, to think through what that might mean, to actually envision, can we dedicate a physical space to this alien landing pad? And then I wanted to give you a second quote that she had, which was, she said, aliens really don't need to land anywhere. They will probably just beam down or something. So we got rid of it with that quote. But what it so beautifully shows, I think, is that you as an institution or as a curator are allowed to speculate and to reinvent and reimagine spaces and technological and spatial responses to notions of surveillance and the moment in which you show the work again. And one of the catchphrases that she used for 2016 was, the crisis is not that you are being surveilled. The crisis today is not to be seen. So the crisis today is that we want to be seen in public spaces, in media spaces. So that's a fundamental shift in our attitude. So we realize not just technologies have changed. For example, we use drones in this as well, drone footage of the building. Not only have buildings changed and have institutions changed, have political and social context changed, no, also we have changed. And all of that inspires the way to move forward with a future iteration. However, it still doesn't really tell us what to do. So that's the conundrum. We now have 3 iterations of one work that is basically a series of approaches and attitudes that tells you collect gear, you collect images and sounds, and you sample them again for the next iteration. You create zones, you create passages, you use latest technologies so it feels contemporary and not dated. But you can also include old technology. So we actually had a mix of screens. And all of that is somehow captured where exactly? Well, I stored things in my mind. I have things on my computer, and so have other colleagues. But we also created something of a database, a media wiki, in fact, that was not public but internal, and a space that would allow you to gather different perspectives, different materials. And I was looking at that just the other day in preparation of this, and I was looking for that, and I realized we have technical diagrams, we have images, installation shots, we have texts, we have reviews, everything. But then among the equipment, there are 2 balls. And I remember the balls. That was a late addition, like coming out of nowhere. Why do we have balls here in this now? Nobody could explain this. This was just an idiosyncratic move on behalf of Julia. But we actually forgot to document that, so there's no image of that. So the process of documentation is a constantly evolving living document, ultimately, that allows you to draw some conclusions, but can also misguide you. And one of the things I'm acutely aware of is if you just rely upon documents that you find in an archive, you might come up with the wrong conclusions. And one is that we never capture everything, clearly. It's impossible. There are always gaps and holes. And sometimes what we capture seems to indicate that this is the state of affairs. Like this projector was used, this screen was used, without saying this is variable, this can change. And the way that it would change would be stay contemporary. I think that's my conclusion for Julia. But I finally want to end, the last example is actually something that you can experience right now. I don't know if you've done that yet. I lack even the precise technology for this, or the word for that. I don't think we restored it, but we adapted the telephone call by Janet Cardiff to our new architecture. And again, the notion of commissioning a site-specific work is based on the idea that this is forever, because the site is the site, you know, and this will always live because the site is the site. But then we realize, well, architectures do change. And a quote from Janet Cardiff while we were producing this: if you guys change the architecture one more time, this is it. I'm not going to do this again. So she... Can you tell them what it originally was? Yes, I'm coming there. So here you have two pictures. On the left, you see the telephone call in 2001. And, the picture is actually from 2008. One of the earliest shows I did at SFMOMA called The Art of Participation. And what you see is I think, high 8 camcorder in which a high 8 video of the telephone call is prompting you to walk through space. And so you see people walking around with a camcorder, filming things which clearly is quite distinct from the show on the right, the picture on the right from last month, and the new production and the new thing that we use now is basically just a smartphone and headphones, obviously. And you see people walking around with smartphones all the time. So again, there is a fundamental shift in those 20 years, and also the notion that a museum stays the same internally is obviously immediately out of the window, because we constantly change the configuration of shows. So the question is, how do you find anchors in a narrative that guides you literally through the space? And you need to find moments of recognition so you know, oh, I'm at the right space here, at the right point in space, rather. And while everything else looks different, and the basic, somewhat related to Julia Scher, once again, the basic idea is you layer two experiences, or rather two perspectives, onto each other. One is the perspective of you being in space, and you walk through the space, and at the same time you look at a video that was recorded exactly in the same space you're walking through. But it has a narrative, it has a story, it has people that you don't see. So there's this layer of a past or some kind of different reality that is superimposed on your reality as you walk through the space. And that was complicated by the fact that large portions, or let's say key portions, of that walk were taken away by our new architecture. So we had to reinvent how to do the telephone call as a video walk. And here you see some more production photos. And now I think I actually have a 2-minute clip or so, or 3 minutes. What you're listening to now is like the first 2 minutes or so of you actually doing the walk, which starts in our atrium on 3rd Street. And and ask you to follow the prompts in the video.
I made this video walk almost 20 years ago, but since then, this building has been completely changed. As I look at this footage, I think about traveling back through the decades, more of them behind me now than there are in front. It makes me want to hold this tiny world of megapixels more carefully, as if somehow it holds a part of me that I've lost.
I have a problem with frogs. I have this mortal fear of frogs. Yeah, I mean, for complicated reasons, but I can't even really look at pictures of them. Wow. And so whenever I'm in Chinatown, I'm a little bit afraid that I'm going to run into a frog because I've heard that they've been serving frog legs now. They're getting really popular.
Batrachophobia.
And
A fear of frogs. Frogs in my soup. Frogs in my bed, crawling up my legs.
Frog legs.
Frogs falling from the sky.
So in the shops, I just generally try not to look.
What am I afraid of? Hello?
What are you thinking about?
Who is this, please?
What do you mean? I'm sitting right beside you.
We have to go now. Point the camera where I'm pointing it. Synchronize your movements with mine.
Let's go make a phone call. When you touch later.
Stand up. Walk to the right. Follow this woman.
Yeah, I think it's all wrong.
Keep on walking around to the right. It's okay. Point the camera at them. They're not there anymore.
And tried starting with the Impressionist artists, but they didn't start until like 1965 or 1968, somewhere at the end of the 60s, and there wasn't very much left for them.
Stop here. I'm going to zoom in. What do you think they're saying?
I think the parks there are just amazing. They're so nice.
Parks?
Mm-hmm. Like Regent Park and Hyde Park and Hampstead Heath. And with the rain, that's just an image of London I have. Just
Turn the camera to the right.
This used to be where the ticket desk was.
I can't hear you.
Simple Simon met the pieman going to the fair. Simple Simon said to the pieman, "Let me taste your ware."
Let's go on. Turn to the right and go up the stairs.
It's a bit awkward. The new stairs are in a different spot. This is the new staircase. One architect erasing another.
Okay, the last word was architecture, one architect erasing the other. But you realize that we have to go to great lengths to actually keep a work alive. And when a work is responsive to an environment or to technologies, you sort of have to go with it, and you have to walk the walk of reinventing it, of reimagining it with the artist, typically. The big unknown question, obviously, is in cases like Janet or Julia Scher, when the artist is not around anymore, to what extent are we able to then just preserve what has been done by the artist, or to what extent can we interpret and re-envision, let's say, predictive engineering to the power of 4? That's an open question, and probably not for me to answer. I will be long gone by that time, I guess. But it's sort of one of the questions that prompted us back, and Shannon was alluding to that 20 years ago, the internet was still quite fresh, and we all felt compelled that, that we needed to work for the internet, with the internet, in making histories of media art accessible. And first of all, we used to do that through publications, and then we realized, well, if we did that online, it could actually be like a living document, and it could grow potentially forever. But of course, then you run out of funding. So it became a 3-year, well, a little bit more than 3-year project, which we called Media Art Net, and which had thematic approaches, but also had the ambition to be global, which we did not really achieve at the time, but also to really make things accessible that were not accessible at all, that were not visible at all, by working with artists. And so I just checked out of curiosity, what did we include by Janet Cardiff? And it was just this one work called In Real Time, which, however, is significant in her work because it actually was the moment where she realized that this could be her thing, to record video walks in spaces that you have experienced. And what you just heard and what you just saw is not just the idea that you're walking through a space that has a past, but in fact it has a layered past now. It has 2 times, one is 2001 and one is 23. But even within 23, if you go there now, you will realize there are people here that obviously are not here anymore. So there's this layer, and then there is Janet on top of all of it, reflecting on the fact that this has changed over time. And a few devices she used to signify that here is now a switch between the two times. So clearly, you see a few small bad images, by the way. It was what we were able to gather at the time. But you also see categories and keywords, so you could sort of cross-reference that. And by the way, it was taken from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art catalog at the time. But there's no video, there's no audio, there's no review, there's no diagrams, there is no exhibition history. Like, so much is not there that could be there, or maybe that should be there. So in a way, this became an educational tool worldwide that was quite successful in connecting the dots of different global histories. And that said, it was still not really inclusive of the Global South, for example. And while it was translated into Mandarin a few years, like 2014 or so, 13, the colleague who managed that and prompted us to publish it in China, Zhang, was then the colleague who invited Shannon and me to work on something that would update MediaArtNet to the 21st century. And we call that MA21, or Media Art 21. And it has 3 major topics: ecology, the post-human, and the commons, which we all 3 individually sort of took on to write about, to gather materials, and for the first time really to make this a Chinese-English bilingual platform that so far exists just as a pilot, and I think is awaiting further funding, and however also has already a few interesting texts and lectures that were recorded, and has an index where I can say, having worked in the field for what now, almost 30 years, half of these people I don't even know. These came through texts that were commissioned by other colleagues who referenced works that I'd never seen, I'd never heard of, and in that way it became a much more inclusive vision of what histories might be told in that. And so we're basically ending I'm ending with one more image, which is to say what Palm Pilot was for Agent Ruby in 2002. We're obviously now very conscious of the fact that we needed to reframe and reprogram this for mobile access, which just looks different. We all act differently on this platform, on this tool, and it's maybe less complex, but it's also much easier to do. And this is like a work in progress that ideally gives us not just different languages for different people, but also different tools to be combined in one platform so that you can experience your work and at the same time, on the same platform, have the reflection about the work. As opposed to, you go into a museum, experience your work, and then you read a review somewhere else about it. So everything is actually connected in that way. And still, it needs pathways through that wealth of material. And those pathways need to be orchestrated, need to be curated, need to be programmed. And that's where the hard labor is, because that always takes time. And so in a way, we will always fail with our big ambition of allowing a global history of media art. But hopefully, it will still open up a lot of narratives that otherwise would be unknown to us. So with that, I'm done for now, and whatever questions you might have.
Rudolf, for such a comprehensive talk, as well as going deeply into a range of really great case studies of key artists as well. I wonder if there's some brewing thoughts or comments or questions from the audience yet? I'll just say one thing off the bat, which is we're calling this course Video Art in Context. Your course at CCA was Media Art in Context. But there's something about context that we think context is a thing outside the art. Here's the art, let's put it in context. And it seems like what you're talking about is when we're talking about art that is site-specific, when the site changes, we're talking about art that is about interaction and responsiveness and changes based on interaction and response. Context isn't over there. Context is part and parcel of the art, which then is the thing that makes it so hard to re-curate again and again, and why it has to be dynamically curated again and again, and also why it needs so many other materials that are thought to be part of the surround that are actually part of the art itself. Anyway.
Well, so true, and at the same time, you obviously also create context. And that is the curator's job. You place things in a certain framework, and to place a piece of surveillance architecture into a framework called film as place is in itself a sort of interesting tension. Please wait for the microphone.
Okay. Sue, who has a question here? Okay. And does anyone have one up there? We'll pass. Oh, you got it. Okay, cool.
Thank you. You talk about the work, the predictive engineering growing exponentially. How does it do that? Because you have a linear number of cameras and you take them over a linear amount of time. So what's your exponential scaling factor? About
exponential growth?
Yeah.
Well, it's a problem. It's a problem in that it obviously leads you to the basic conundrum of collecting is you can't just keep doing it all the time. Otherwise, you run out of space, out of manpower, out of so many things at some point eventually. But the idea that there is a constant process of reviewing, even within a collection or even within an artwork, like what do we actually keep here and what do we show? I think that's I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by works approaches, attitudes that require you to engage the work from who you are in this moment. And you're doing this for this show or this place. And I think we are not technically challenged by a database that grows exponentially. I think we can safely store that as long as it keeps going. You are technically challenged by things that might change fundamentally, like Agent Ruby had a Flash application. Flash doesn't work anymore, is obsolete, so we had to change that. So this is typical museum stuff. You know, you do migrations of technologies. But I always like to say that most media artworks keep you on your toes and keep you engaged. And if you think that's a problem, then just do not deal with media art. But if you like that, if you feel that this is actually what you are hoping to achieve or hoping to get from art, that it engages you, then this is for you. So, so exponential growth is one example I did not include, but off the top of my head, I can say we have a work by Hans Hake in the collection called News, and it's from 1969. We updated it to Internet Times in 2008, and it prints out news from news agencies across the world onto dot matrix printer, and it just spills that into the gallery. So at some point you have to say, okay, this is enough. You know, we can't have more paper in the gallery, so you physically have to actually reduce it in size, and this is okay with the artist. So, so it's a, I don't know. Maybe you had a more philosophical question about this. I don't know.
This on? Okay. I think you were wondering, is it literally exponential? And maybe it's not literally exponential. And so it's not. But so it's a bit more about how do you curate something, an art event that is iterative and sort of gestures to exponentiality, that this could just keep continuing, right? And then how do you reckon with that? Even, I'll just go back, like the Miranda July, Learning to Love You More, with all of those different pictures that followed the assignment, you know, it's going to also keep going, but you still found a way to curate the proposition of it continuing, even if you're not literally showing it every single thing that continues, right?
But, you know, what is embedded in this idea is actually the potential that it could actually grow forever.
Exactly, and that's what you're still curating. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that be great if you walked into a gigantic gallery with just Hans Hake's news and you would see like 3 months of news all spilled out on the floor? Mm-hmm. I would love to do that. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's not realistic, but...
Right. Yes, here. Thanks.
Thank you. I was wondering, how do you...
Up a little bit.
Okay, yeah. I was wondering, how do you perceive the creators of these artworks to negotiate the fact that eventually and inevitably they won't be around to revive these works as they intended in their original vision? And especially, how do you look at that? You say that these artworks are intended to sort of live forever and dynamically and sort of have this composition with themselves that exponentiates in a way. So eventually, it's clear that might go off the rails from what the artist originally intended as time progresses, right? Is that something that creators usually accept, or is that something that they kind of fight?
Well, I'm doing my best to make this acceptable, to push the institutions. It's always a negotiation. And it's a negotiation that involves the artist as much as we can, but involves also all colleagues. And one of the things we do really well at SFMOMA, I think, compared to maybe other museums, is we actually have an ongoing series of conversations around these issues. Once a month, we meet. It's called Team Media. And it doesn't really have an agenda. Whatever is current, whatever feels like an urgent question right now, people just bring it up. And you realize that even though I deal with media art, I have dealt with media art for almost 30 years, I'm technically not a very savvy person. I need others to actually solve problems of software or coding, even operating a PC sometimes. This is a banal fact in a way, but it is always a teamwork and a collaboration. And then, of course, everybody has lots to do. So can we make things work quickly? Unfortunately, oftentimes not. I can tell you the restoration of the telephone call took 6 years. It drove me crazy, but that's just the reality. And I only managed in the end because I was able to say, okay, I'm co-curating a collection show now. This is part of that show. So you have to do this now. Because it's on the checklist. You cannot say no anymore. But yeah, it's complicated. However, I think maybe this speaks to the whole course and to the field in general. What the Kramnik Art Foundation started almost 20 years ago was something called New Art Trust, which is the idea that we would collectively, as institutions, share knowledge and sit down and figure out, well, how do we deal with this field? How do we collect it? How do we display it? How do we deal with conservation issues and so on? So it was very successful in organizing those kinds of workshops and gatherings and convenings and coming up with certain templates. But ultimately, the idea that you can solve a problem is out of the window. You do not solve problems anymore. You can deal with problems, but they will just come back at you in different forms and different formats. So you are constantly, again, positively said, you're constantly engaged with it. But I also have to acknowledge that this takes time and money to do, and there's only so much we can do. So in a way, you obviously focus on what you think is really important. I think Janet Cardiff, the telephone call, is really important for our collection because it engages visitors, something we write large, something that is about our space and about our past. So.
I don't know why I'm there. Rudolf, you began this. Do you have a question? Okay, cool. We'll take one last question.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I think paying attention to media ecologies, some of what strikes me as most artful and interesting has a lot to do with a kind of like almost promiscuity or fluidity in which things move and mutate and evolve online. And I think that comes into tension with a kind of possessive individualism that really characterizes how a lot of art is shown, usually in the museum context. So I think I was hoping maybe you could speak a little bit to that kind of.
I'm not sure. Was there a question that I didn't quite get? Or?
Yeah, no. It's a comment and an invitation for reflections, but.
The notion of the artist's signature, that the artist's signature that controls and authors this particular work as if it has neat boundaries that this type of form challenges.
Well, I think I mentioned this to some extent, that we obviously collaborate with the artists, and one of the conditions of the telephone call was that Janet Carter said, "Well, I need to figure out if this works at all. I don't know if we can adapt to the new space, if we can find a form to combine the past and the present from 2001 and 23. And ultimately, I think she found a way of doing that worked for her. But yes, in a certain way, if the artist cannot sign off on a certain format or a certain display that we have agreed upon, then maybe we fail to do our job right, which is to actually ask all those questions in advance. Actually, when we acquire the work, we ask tons of questions. What do we do here? What is your opinion on this? Can we change from film to digital? Tassilin would say, absolutely not. Put that in the report. How can we assure that the quality of our display is adequate? All those questions, how involved are you? And some artists were very clear, and Harold Fletcher and Miranda July is a really good example in that. They say, you can do what you want as long as you respect the fact that you need to communicate these were the 70 assignments that we created. This needs to be communicated. And the rest is whatever. You show one work, you show one assignment, you show all, it's all good. Because the work is still online anyway.
It really shows there's a connection then between this question and the last question about asking about what happens when things change. And part of the answer is to say at the time of acquisition, there's an attempt to anticipate. Yes, you can digitize. No, you can't. Oh, you could, if VHS goes out of fashion, you can put this on something else. But also, it does seem that some of the artists at that time of acquisition are more or less open to releasing from possessive individualism. A little bit like, I actually don't have to know, or I don't have to anticipate, as long as a certain parameters stay. Part of the point is that they acknowledge that the work is something that exceeds them, and others don't.
Well, it is the default institutional response is, if we don't know that this is signed off, we don't show this. We can't do this. Or another default response is, this was the last time it was shown in this way, so let's just go with that, because we know that that was okay. And I would say to that, well, that was okay in 1995. It's not okay today, actually. So we need to have a sense of sort of empowerment almost to also interpret the work and feel confident, because we have analyzed and we have sort of the artistic intention behind us, that we feel confident that we can also make curatorial choices about this in the future. This would be the case, for example, for Julia Scher, predictive engineering. You don't have to employ drone footage in, let's say, 2030, when there is maybe some very brand new technology around that is much more appropriate to acknowledge and to incorporate then. But you do know the type of footage that she created, that she recorded. So you can replicate that. And then you acknowledge that in the history of the work by saying this was produced in accordance with the understanding of the previous iterations, something like that.
You started your lecture talking about the importance of not having a notion of knowledge as something that's fixed, and to make sure that learning is something that is ongoing, and that's so key for these works. And you're ending on that theme as well, which seems so appropriate and so generous for you to say here at UC Berkeley in this context where we also want to instill in everyone that knowledge is something that's information and learning is ongoing. So thank you so much today, Rudolf, for your contribution to that ethos.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody.